Hey, well, people are filtering in. Welcome. I see Ruby's in the house. Hi, Ruby. Great to see so many familiar names here. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Rebecca Prime, Editor-in-Chief of Film Quarterly, and delighted to have here with us to discuss this historic double strike of the WGA and SAG. It's very fitting, a happy accident that this webinar, which we've been talking about for a few months now, ended up being scheduled today with the WGA meeting with the AMTP for the first time since the beginning of the strike, almost exactly 3 months ago. So today we're going to be discussing what's at stake and have an incredible lineup of panelists here with us to give us their insights into the implications for today's mediascape and particularly for us as a community of film and media studies scholars, teachers, and practitioners. So I'll just take a moment to introduce our panelists. We have with us James Schamus, who wears an incredible number of hats. He is screenwriter, director, producer, professor, and of course, most importantly, Film Quarterly board member. So thank you very much, James, for joining us today. We also have Howard Rodman, who likewise is a man of many talents, screenwriter, novelist, professor, former WGA president, and who also has some exciting news that he was just elected to vice president of the Academy Board. So many congratulations to you, Howard, for that. Next up, we have Kate Fortmueller, who is a film studies scholar, historian, and author of Below the Stars: How the Labor of Working Actors and Extras Shapes Media Production, and Hollywood Shutdown, Production, Distribution, and Exhibition in the Time of COVID, both of which came out in 2021. So amazing feat, 2 books in 1 year. So very productive. And finally, I'd like to introduce Steven Canals, who is the Emmy-nominated and Peabody Award-winning co-creator, executive producer, director, and writer of the fabulous FX drama series Pose. So welcome to all of you. We're going to begin today by giving each of you the opportunity to share your thoughts about what are some of the key issues for you in these strikes, what questions you're hoping we're going to be able to cover in today's conversation. And then we'll move on to our roundtable portion. And then finally, in the last 15 minutes of this webinar, we'll be opening the conversation to you, our audience. So please go ahead and post whatever questions you have to the Q&A and to the chat, and we'll do our best to try to get to as many questions as we can. So with that, let's begin. I'll pass things over to you, James, if you want to get us started.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining. Thanks too to the Film Quarterly team for pulling this together. It's a real honor to be sharing space with this panel. And especially at this particular moment when being in the thick of things as I kind of am as a member of this year's negotiating committee for the Writers Guild of America. Rebecca mentioned that there's a meeting today. It's in fact not with our team. It's not yet a negotiating meeting. It's a meeting between our chief negotiator and the chief negotiator for the AMPTP, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. And part of the reason that we're entering month 4 of this strike and now joined by our siblings at SAG-AFTRA, the Actors Union, is because the AMPTP has used a playbook that they've used fairly successfully, although not completely so, over the course of many decades to attempt to divide and conquer Hollywood's labor force. And in this cycle, they used an old trick from an old playbook, which was to move our negotiations ahead of those that they conducted with the Directors Guild of America. They moved, or in a sense, they moved the DGA after us. Their goal was to, in a sense, usher us into a strike situation we conducted months-long pre-negotiations and negotiations with them that ended at the end of April without a fair contract even on the table to discuss. And then we published the very night that we were booted out of the conference room at the Galleria Mall office tower, at which the AMPTP has its headquarters, a 2-page précis, which is available to anybody online, that laid out exactly what our last proposal was and what the last and seemingly best, but clearly not best response from the AMPTP was. So the way we've conducted business as a guild has emphasized the transparency both to the greater public and to our members. And I think that's worked very well for us. And you'll see if you look at that document that our core proposals having to do with an array of issues ranging from generative artificial intelligence to the use of so-called mini rooms, that is to say, small rooms where writers who used to be working throughout the course of production under the guidance of a showrunner, kind of executive producer writer, are now being kind of jammed into rooms for shorter amounts of time on shorter series, and then kind of given their papers and sent home, so that there's no more culture left remaining, or there's the culture, but there isn't the support for that culture that allowed for entry level and middle level writers to get the kind of mentorship and training on set to run shows that was traditionally the case when you had rooms that employed writers throughout most of the course of the seasons on which they were employed. These mini rooms also create an increased state of precarity among our membership, such that the guild basic minimums that have been negotiated in 3-year cycles over the course of now many, many decades, since the first round of significant negotiations took place over 6 decades ago, are now not just minimums, they are now the default for an increasingly large percentage of our members, including those at the senior level. Showrunners themselves are increasingly working for what is essentially guild minimum, and those minimums have resulted, and those working conditions have resulted in an effective lowering of annual income to our members at almost by 24%, I think, is over the last 3 years since the last agreement. Whereas, of course, we all read the news and see what the heads of the conglomerates are up to. We're negotiating against a different AMPTP this year because it includes now amongst its ranks not simply representatives from the labor relations divisions and of the so-called legacy media companies, which are themselves the result of massive conglomerization that's taken place since the Clinton-Gore years, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which allowed for this extraordinary concentration of power and essentially the voiding of the last remnants of the effects of the 1948 Paramount Consent Decree, right? So now we've also got Netflix, we've got Amazon, we've got Apple, we've got our tech overlords at work. And hence the flashpoint of artificial intelligence, generative AI, and its uses has become central both to our negotiations and clearly those of our siblings at SAG-AFTRA. That all said, as a table set, I'm excited to now listen to my fellow panelists because I think the longue durée and the history and the context of this current struggle are really important. And by longue durée, I do refer specifically to Howard Rodman, who not only has a commanding knowledge of the history of this stuff, but is actually embodying most of it.
Well, thank you so much, James, for setting that up and providing such a great overview. And over to you, Howard.
Yeah, my grandfather on his deathbed gave me 3 pieces of advice. He said, never eat at a restaurant called Mom's, never sit down at a poker table with a man called Doc, and never follow James Schamus on a webinar. But here we are. I'd really like to thank everyone at FQ for assembling this panel. I feel in extraordinarily good company. And I'd like to thank all of you for who are attending. Because a webinar without an audience is a sad thing. This is a lot better. James talked about the longue durée. I want to go back to 2007, 2008, the last time the Writers Guild was on strike. At that point, we struck for 100 days, and there was, in essence, there were a lot of things on the table, but there was really one overriding issue. and that was jurisdiction over what was then called new media, which is now called the world. If you think of Netflix, if you think of Hulu, if you think of Apple, if you think of anything with plus after its name, none of that would have been under guild jurisdiction. It would all have been the Wild West. At the beginning of that 100-day strike, they said it was unthinkable to give us that jurisdiction because they didn't even know what new media was or were, and they didn't have a business model for it. And if it ever started to make money for them, then they would be very happy to talk to us again. In the same way that when in this negotiation we proposed something on AI, they said, well, how about we meet once a year and talk about it? So the only thing that has kept in 2007, 2008, all of what we do from being yanked out like a conjurer's tablecloth from underneath us was the persistence of the guild. And after 100 days, they gave us something they said was unthinkable at the beginning of those 100 days, which was jurisdiction over, again, what was then new media, what is now pretty much everything. And there are many, many different issues in the current negotiations, as opposed to one easy bullet point issue that you can talk about in a 15-second soundbite. We are fighting for streaming residuals to get full theatrical terms. In other words, if your movie isn't released theatrically, but it's released to a streamer, you should still get what you would have gotten if they'd released it in a theater. For screenwriters, we do an astonishing amount of free work, and now the norm rather than the exception is to just pay people for a draft. But everybody who screenwrites knows that when they pay you for a draft, you're doing 2, 3, 7, 17 drafts. So we're trying to at least say under certain circumstances, you get a guaranteed second step. So at least you're paid for 2 of your 17 drafts. For comedy variety writers, we want streaming video minimums. For the practice of mini rooms, and let me just explain that a little bit. It used to be that they'd assemble a team of writers who would be involved in pre-production, breaking the story, writing the episodes, production. And now in sort of classic Fordism, sorry, Ford Foundation, assembly line way, they are trying to, break the process of making television into various discrete little bits, and for each bit have as few people and for as low a salary as they can, and have the parts arrive just in need. Maybe you can make cars this way, but you can't make television this way, and we're trying to tell them. We want people who are employed before a green-lighted TV show, to at least half of them to be employed through production. We want minimums during post-production. And then there are other things. Certainly foreign streaming residuals are very important. And viewership-based residuals. If they got a lot of eyeballs on something, we should get some money for that. But for all of these things, and I don't want to accent any one of them, because if you're in negotiations, if you say this is important to me, they'll just ignore all the other stuff. So let's just assume that all of these are equally important. But what's really at stake here is we see what we do as creating a value for ourselves, a value for them, and a value for the larger audience. They see what we do as simply a cost. And if what you're trying to do is impress your stockholders or impress Wall Street, you want to have each quarter a return on investment higher than the quarter before, so you put downward pressure on fixed costs. It's what they do. A virus has no morals. And so now that the film business has changed profoundly, I'm going to use the sentence of James's former partner, Ted Hope. The studio's theatrical release single title revenue-driven model has been replaced by the global streamer's platform-first, portfolio-based, attention-driven audience acquisition model. Love that. What we want to do is say the model of the industry has changed. We need a contract which acknowledges those changes and make sure that those changes aren't accomplished at the expense of our members' ability to earn a living.
Thank you so much, Howard, for that perspective. For more historical perspective, let's move over to you now, Kate, to talk about how your work intersects here.
Well, thank you again for having me. I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to go back further than 2007-8, actually. I'm going to try to kind of synthesize the history of strikes. So I like to do the full history sometimes in as short as few words as possible. So I think one of the things that's been interesting, strikes are horrible. Everyone wants to be working. These are incredibly disruptive. And I mean that not in the like kind of faux tech way of like disruptors, but labor is the real disruptor. Elon Musk is not the real disruptor. I'll go there. So labor is kind of, I see as is able to really sort of shake things up. And I think in good ways oftentimes. So thinking a little bit about sort of the long history of strikes, we can think a little bit up to 1952. So the IATSE first contract 1926, SAG-AFTRA, the WGA 33, DGA 36. Those are kind of above the line unions, as people often called the DGA, WGA, and SAG. Were not big strikers in the first part of their history. That changes after 52, but really changes right in 1960. And I think one of the ways that we can think about that shift is that Hollywood workers start to move away in some ways from thinking about set conditions, which is a big concern for some of the IATSE locals, to thinking a little bit more about the kind of value of their work over time. And I think one of the things that's really important about that is and I think 1960 really shows us this, right, is that you have a lot of workers thinking about how to make this a career, as it is difficult, like in a moment when we're post-Paramount decrees and a lot of workers are on freelance contracts, don't have pension and health, aren't necessarily making a good living with actors. That is still the case. So start thinking a little bit more about how their union can help kind of round things out to make this a more viable career, whether that's through residuals or the long-term promise of pension or the kind of regular healthcare. So I think this kind of shift in terms of union priorities that happens around the mid-20th century is a particularly meaningful one. I think if anyone's been paying attention to strike commentary, I was going to say, or like me, if you've been reading everything kind of compulsively, watching videos on Instagram, maybe you haven't, but you'll hear oftentimes a lot of people say every major strike has been about residuals. That's true. I think some of the things that are really interesting about this particular strike, James and Howard summed up in, I think, really effective ways. I think the kind of point about writers doing an astonishing amount of free work is something that we should really think about, and also think about in relation to tech and tech's kind of like creep into Hollywood, or at least tech cultures. I think that has kind of largely happened without us realizing that tech has kind of creeped in. I think we've all, as audience members, embraced it. We've, especially the last 3 years, embraced streaming, embraced the language of, or abandoned the language in some cases of film and television, and embraced the language of content, which kind of flattens out some of these kind of differences, which are really meaningful for contract negotiations. So I think kind of to situate this particular strike in that kind of long history, I think we might be at a kind of different moment that's not just about thinking about residuals and a particular kind of like tier of worker who can achieve residuals, but having to think a little bit more about what this work looks like on a day-to-day basis, what this means to kind of make a career in Hollywood. And I'll think a little bit to actors, because we have a lot of writers on this panel. I've written about actors, so I'll try to throw something in about actors, so they're not, because there's so many of them, and they're really, I'm kind of, as somebody who has studied actors a lot, I was really, really shocked at the strike authorization vote. The 98% was absolutely mind-boggling to me. I thought it would be a lot of them. 1960 was 87%, just for a frame of reference. So this is a significantly higher kind of percentage. It's a really factious union in the sense that you have a lot of people with different priorities. It's a two-party union, and the kind of membership first, unite for strength are often kind of like at odds with what the priority of that union should be. So to speak to some of that kind of day-to-day work, I think in addition to, and I'll try to wrap this up, I could talk about this forever, but I'll try to wrap this up so we can start the conversation after Steven talks. But I think one of the things that is really interesting about the actors' slate of points is not just that it's about kind of residuals and data transparency and things that are kind of tied to issues that they may have addressed in the past, but also these kinds of things about the self-tape auditions, which have become a bigger deal since the pandemic. Even though self-tape auditions actually have a longer history, they've existed since the 70s. But again, this is a thing where you have, right, casting directors, producers offloading a lot of work that used to be done by others to put this on actors so that they have to kind of like adjust tape, have equipment to kind of do all of this auditioning in their own homes. And again, I think this has been growing. I've talked to a lot of voice actors, and this is especially significant with voice actors who have to have like, do have to kind of outlay a lot of money, right? So you're outlaying a lot of money for recording equipment and booths for a career where you might not be making over $26,000 a year. So these kinds of things where you have the union kind of looking at these conditions and really trying to figure out how to make this a more viable career day to day, I think is an interesting kind of shift in addition to some of the things we've been talking about for years.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you there so we can move on to Steven. But thank you so much for bringing in the acting side, because there definitely is a bit of a heavy emphasis in this panel. We unfortunately were not able to get someone from SAG in our time frame, so we'll go back to that. But Steven, I imagine you can also speak to those issues as well as someone who is, you know, in the trenches as a showrunner. So over to you.
All right, thank you everyone for having me. It's great to be here. I want to personalize the conversation that we're having right now, solely because I think, you know, obviously James and Howard and Kate spoke really beautifully about the more salient issues, and I think there are folks who are more articulate and smarter than I to discuss them. But for me, I'm not simply a writer or director or producer. I'm also a member of the LGBTQ person as a card-carrying queer, and I also am Afro-Puerto Rican. And so I have a commitment to communities that are often left behind. And so when the beginnings of the strike began, you know, I was really concerned about my contemporaries and folks who look like me and folks who are telling stories as I did with and have been doing with my own work. You know, one of the first things I want to note is that if you look at all of the wonderful studies and reporting that comes out of the Writers Guild, you know, if in the past 2 years, we've seen percentages rise, right? So we know that from 2017 to 2021, the number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who joined the Guild rose from 25% to 50%. You know, we know that the percentage of women who joined the Guild in 2017 went from 41% to 53%, again, in 2021, entering into 2022. However, when you look at the statistics from the 2022 Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity report coming out of the Guild, the reality is that a lot of these folks are being left behind, right? So if we're looking specifically at, regardless of gender, folks of color, so Black, Latin, Asian, we're getting stuck in the lowest levels, right? So we're remaining in these you know, a staff writer, story editor, executive story editor. Some folks maybe will trickle into co-producer level. So that's really disconcerting and concerning. And I think that when we're looking at this conversation specifically around mini rooms and shorter orders, you know, it becomes all the more disheartening and concerning because, well, for one reason, just to be frank, I am the exception, I'm not the rule. as a queer Afro-Puerto Rican who has made it to the executive producer level, who has co-created a show, there aren't very many people who look like me who are in that very small room that includes creators and EPs. And so, I wonder in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, how many more folks, how many more of my contemporaries who happen to also be queer or of color will make it to that level. And so beyond, who are getting opportunities, I'm also thinking about the sustainability of our industry. So, I think that Howard spoke to this as well. We're not seeing training happening in rooms. When we have shorter orders, there just isn't enough time. I know from a personal perspective that, being a showrunner and wearing many hats is a lot of work. And so mentorship is not at the forefront when you're working through a short order, and especially when you have the studios and or the network saying, we've got to get through the room as quickly as possible so that we can move into production. Additionally, we're not seeing folks being sent, really, in very many levels, being sent to set to produce their own work. And so again, it just creates an environment where folks are being hired or being put in the position of executive producer and or showrunner without having worked on the skills necessary to be in that position. And I think, again, like, I'm fortunate in that when I sold Pose to FX, I had Ryan Murphy as a co-creator and as a fellow executive producer, who throughout the beginning of that first season said, sit next to me, pay attention. And so whether I recognized it or not, like, there was mentorship that was happening, and I was being fed 20 years of experience that then allowed me to go off and to work on the show that I wanted to for the remaining 2 seasons. But I know, again, I'm the exception, I'm not the rule. And I've talked to very many folks who have not had that experience. And so I don't think that we're setting up folks for success. But additionally, I'm worried about where all of the beautiful content is supposed to come from in this golden era, golden age of television. So.
Well, thank you so much, Steven. That's a really important perspective that you brought in, and something that, I think we can speak further about in the rest of this webinar. Does anyone want to get us started with, a question to get the roundtable going? Or, well, I'll throw something out there. Just in reading, in preparation for today's webinar, I was really struck by how this feels like such a moment of inflection, akin to really, we've talked about the strike in 1960, and that was sort of also fueled by new technology, television. It was a new format. We were no longer in the vertically integrated studio system era, so there needed to be a new structure in place. And do you think, are we in another sort of moment like that, like, akin to the collapse of the studio system, where we're really shifting over to a new production paradigm? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think that shift has already occurred. In the old days, for instance, in the television space, each episode was standalone. If you had 100 episodes, you could shuffle them in any order you wanted to, and then syndicate them. When series started having arcs, small arcs, season-long arcs, the institution of the writer's room, particularly for drama, came to the fore, because you needed a whole bunch of people to keep track of all the characters and where they were going in terms of that longer journey. The streamers have found that they get their eyeballs on the basis of churn. Here's a bright, shiny object in front of you. Here's another bright, shiny object in front of you. So for them, 4, 6, 8 episode seasons actually served them better and cost them less than what was the traditional TV season. This has led to an enormous number of knock-on consequences, some of which could have been anticipated, some which could not have. And among them is exactly what Steven was talking about, which is the breakdown of the ability to train the next generation, and also the ability of writers to make their years. So that shift has already happened. And I think what this strike will decide is whether the ability of the creative community to sustain itself is going to continue in the face of a vastly different business model than the one that traditionally shared some of the wealth with the people whose work creates it. I think there's another question too, which is certainly, I think, maybe more prominent on the big screen side, which is the greed of the people who control the entertainment industry in a vertically integrated way, going to make us all stupid, drooling, passive consumers of increasingly empty spectacles. I think more and more the economics of the entertainment industry is not unlike what William Burroughs saw as the economics of the heroin trade. Don't improve the product, degrade the buyer. And so I think this is also a strike to reset the industry, not only in terms of wages and working conditions, but also in terms of, is this industry really serving its function to enlighten, to provoke, to bring new voices to the fore? Or will we in 50 years regard the entertainment industry the way we now regard the tobacco industry? I think all of that is really at stake in this strike.
Thank you, Howard. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Well, I'd say just on the practical, but also, let's say, historical perspective, to the point that Howard, you made in quoting my former partner, Ted Hope, but the quote was 18,000 words. I think I got the gist. And the gist is very, very fundamental to the issues that we're dealing with and grappling with in ways that we've yet to determine the outcome. And that is, the unit of value by which one could account profit and loss up until a few years ago was essentially localized in the aesthetic form, whether it was the episode, the film, the series, whatever that was. You could say, well, they made it the movie for 10 and it grossed 15 and the cost and this and the Hollywood accounting, but you would still, everything would route through that unit. That is no longer the case in the streaming world. Basically what we make now are advertisements for the ecosystem that is hosting, however vampiristically, temporarily or otherwise, our work. That is to say, we're there to keep the churn to a minimum and to acquire the maximum of viewers and to, in a sense, increase the market share of whichever of these monolithic entities is going to survive this gigantic war that's being waged with vast amounts of financialized capital in terms of capturing that market share on the Amazon model of let's lose money for 20 years, but at such spectacular scale that by the time anybody tries to enter the marketplace, we already control it, right? And then you can start to take your profits. So it's a speculative frenzy that's resting on a particular kind of specular experience of our audience, which, again, to Howard, your point, is a distracted one, right? Everybody on this webinar has had this experience, which is hey, we're in the media thing. It's Thursday night. Let's crack open a bottle of wine, kick back, and just check out what's on Netflix or whatever, And I guarantee you, if you don't click on the first thing that's up there on the landing page above the fold, that gigantic banner, and you start to scroll through it and go, oh, well, let me just check out what else is there. I guarantee you've all had this experience. Within about 45 seconds, you're bored out of your fucking mind. And you really have this feeling of swimming in a sea of crap. When in fact, there's a lot of good stuff there, but there's also a kind of content heat death that these systems need. So they're engineered to keep you initially, the perfect viewer that sustains this ecosystem is a viewer who is distracted, witless, and not making their own decision. They have to capture you as quickly as possible, because the longer you scroll through in this environment, the more you're probably going to go, I give up, right? So everything we do now is advertising for that particular form of spectatorship that is not meant to engage our potential audiences in any substantial way, other than, oh, that thumbnail looks cool, it's got a boot and a naked person, I'll click. And so how can we go about and readjust our expectations on how to share a piece of the pie that we've been making in this environment, an environment where the data itself is no longer data, but it's just actionable stuff for machine learning in real time to push or pull off of these menus, what we're doing. That's a big challenge.
Yeah. And of course, we haven't really talked yet about the role of AI in these conversations and the threat posed to AI, both to the work of the writer and of the actor. So, Kate, would you like to sort of speak about that for a moment in terms of actors? Because I know that's a very prominent concern in their negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think sort of speaking to that, I mean, I think I will say this, I think that AI is a very serious threat. I think the terms need to get set now. I feel like it's become, because it's a new technology, it's kind of bubbled to the surface of a lot of these conversations. And I'm not sure it's necessarily the only or most important thing that needs to be focused on in terms of these negotiations. I think I do think that it's something that, with actors, and I was saying I've had a lot of conversations with voice actors as part of my research, and I think there's a lot of concern, and has been for years, of that work is very replaceable, and sort of that there's a lack of control over how your voice or your vocal likeness is being used. So as far as kind of that goes, my sense of at least from following this, is that they need clear terms, they need decisive terms so that actors can have more control kind of over how they are being used. I think that is something they absolutely deserve. I think I've talked to a few people about this, that I think actors aren't used to selling their full bodies for likeness, to be used in perpetuity for, here, just use me however you want, right? That's not sort of what that arrangement is as an artist, that you're not selling yourself in that way. And so I think the way that the AMPTP is asking them to kind of engage with AI, I think is really a bridge too far. I think that's the case with a lot of the terms. I think for everyone, I think what the AMPTP is asking is a bridge too far in a lot of ways. But I think especially in that way, I think it's trying to fundamentally shift sort of an actor's relationship to their body and their career and how they engage with their work in ways that I think is probably counterproductive. Also, I'm not sure I want to teach contemporary film if it's all AI. So I'll just go full film historian and won't. Because I think for me, that's a bridge too far personally.
We have questions which I can turn to. Are there other things that you panelists would like to bring up before we move over to some of the questions that are coming in?
I just love to add on the AI front that it's easy to fall prey to AI as a bogeyman. AI is going to replace us writers and they'll just generate scripts and etc. That's not particularly my worry. My worry is rather the way AI or generative AI or any algorithmically based management tools condition our work. In other words, turn us into rewriters. And it's already conditioning the notes that we receive, which were already fundamentally hilarious before machine learning took over, and now are becoming more mind-bogglingly. And it is that garbage in, garbage out problem for a lot of the services who, you remember, 95% of the content on most of the streaming services is not marketed outside of the service. It's called product discovery. It's all there for discovery, right? And I won't go into the technologies, although Netflix has a very good tech blog. I recommend it to everybody, about which they share some, but not all, of course, of how they manage this. What they don't share is what they're telling their executives to tell Steven and Howard and myself when we turn the scripts in, well, what if we do, that. But the AI on the actor side is of course presents itself with an immediate insidious image of just they scan you and now they got your voice and that's it. But I think that if you start at the micro level and look at, for example, the way in which terms are being negotiated in the commercial world for what they call addressable edits, that is to say, the ability to target, let's say, in-product advertising on billboards in the background of your favorite series directly to you. So if you're watching a Mannix rerun as occasionally Howard and I will, but also Lincoln Lawyer, as he walks by a billboard, it's going to be there for, whatever, hair products that we would like for me and for something different for you. But you can imagine that going a step further and saying, hey, you want your show shown in Florida, you better take that queer couple and maybe rearrange the gender. It's just easy. It's a press of a button. So the addressability of what we make will be fine-tuned to real extremes, right? How are you going to release this in Saudi Arabia or China or Florida, right? And there's an array of ways in which addressable editing and AI work hand in hand to do that. We've not even begun to have that discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, James. Okay, we've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to turn over now. This is from Leslie Willard, who said, thanks for the great panel. As noted, new media has been a catalyst both in the 2007-2008 negotiations and at present. In the current moment, new media has expanded significantly regarding content creators on and across social platforms who often aspire to work in media and also deal with precarity, similar to below-the-line workers. A couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of back and forth debate online about who exactly falls under the jurisdiction of the guilds and how those content creators can and should support the strike. I'm curious as to the panelists' opinion around the blurry lines around content creators and guild jurisdictions. So, I don't know. Howard, do you want to take a gander at that?
Yeah, because they have turned what we have done from creativity into content, which is, a despicable word. Therefore, the distinction between professionally generated content, user-generated content, it's very, very blurry. And particularly as, the Uberization of the entertainment industry turns us all into gig workers, and the TikTokization of the entertainment industry turns us all into ADHD freaks. The lines between what in the old world was written by professional writers in a professional context to what is, part of the larger cultural free-for-all, it's very hard to tell. In terms of contract stuff, it's easy. If you write for a company that is a signatory to the guild contract, you are in the union and it is under those terms. And if not, it's outside of that. But I think if history teaches us anything, it's that we want to find a way not to police those voices outside of the traditional system, but to understand that that's where new voices, new energy are going to come from, and make sure that they have access to adequate means of production rather than are marginalized in the way that Steven talked about so eloquently a couple of minutes ago.
Yeah. Steven, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, I don't know that what I'm going to say answers the question, but this was maybe a week or two ago, there was a young person who is a TikTok, I suppose, influencer, not quite sure. I don't have TikTok, I'm acknowledging that, but this gentleman was talking about the strike and said that during this period of time that he would continue to make content. And I saw he was trending on the app formerly known as Twitter, and was essentially, there was like a public flogging of the fact that he wasn't in solidarity. And it was interesting to see the discourse come out of that, because you obviously have the very militant folks whose fists are in the air saying we have to, fight the man and fight the system. And then you have folks who are on the other side saying, for all intents and purposes, like TikTok isn't a signatory, like he isn't a member of the guild, so of any guild, whether it's, SAG or otherwise. And so he should be able to make the content that he wants to make. I think that we're in this is separate and apart from our conversation around the strike, but I think in this moment of cancel culture, it's very quick when someone doesn't carry the same beliefs or politics as you to say you're done. And so I think it's complicated. I think the one great thing coming out of what I privately would call this influencer culture is that they're creating content on their own terms. Whether or not they're able to monetize that is another conversation. I'm not convinced that they all are, because I think a lot of that with the metrics has to do with how many people are following you and et cetera. But, obviously, I think TikTok's different from YouTube, and I don't know how that's also shifted in the last 5-10 years, but I appreciate that you have young people who are saying, I have a voice, I have something very specific that I want to say, and I'm going to create that content on my own terms, and it's going to be direct to the consumer or to the audience. There isn't any middle person involved. So that I think I appreciate. And I know, on the picket line, those are conversations that I've been hearing quite a bit with writers and with actors who recently joined the writers, which is there a way for us to create the content that we want to, and to not have to go through studios and networks? So I'm curious to see how this will evolve and emerge coming out of the strike.
Thank you so much, Steven. It's great. Let's move on. We have another question here from JD Connor. How do you think the rise of ad-supported streaming changes the debate about ratings transparency or the calculus around negotiating for ratings transparency? Anyone want to take a crack at that? James?
I can jump in. I mean, look, the Screen Actors Guild has surprisingly really taken a lead by trying to find a proxy metric that will serve the similar function to the kind of proxy metrics that worked in the industry. For example, box office gross was never a real metric, because if you made a movie for $100 million and grossed $100 million, or you made a movie for one and it grossed $100 million, $100 million means a lot of different things. But the gross was at least a proxy for certain forms of success and certain forms of value, right? So now with the rise of AVOD, ad-supported video on demand, or FAST, right, advertising-supported television channels, you're starting to see more and more pressure on the streaming ecosystems to share data. I have a lot of issues and questions about that myself, and a lot of opinions, which I won't burden everybody with now. But one thing I will say is watch some of these players who are out there who are very smart players within the system. People like Peter Chernin, who used to be the chairman of Fox. He started a new production company. They've got $1 billion in finance capital behind them, and that they're gambling that $1 billion on the streamers eventually sharing data, right? And then giving them profit participations based on various kinds of proxy metrics that would approximate the way creators and producers have shared before. So they're betting on it. And so from within the system, you're starting to see a kind of a breakup of that vertical black box. But I'm not necessarily betting on them. I think we have to force the issue ourselves across a wide spectrum of touch points. But remember, the data itself is already actionable in real time in Cupertino. It's itself acting on itself all the time. And as scholars call it surplus data, right? These days, if you're up with as I know JD Connor is. And so the value of the data is the value of the action on the data in real time. And that's something that we just can't track.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to keep going because we've got 10 minutes and a bunch of questions. So here's one from Lucy Marzola. Given this invasion of tech culture into Hollywood, do you feel there is too much of a disconnect between those at the top of the studios, repped by the AMPTP, and the guilds? Are they even having the same conversation when they show such a clear lack of understanding of what creatives in Hollywood are actually doing? And yeah, it's a great question, one I've been thinking about. So anyone want to grab that one?
Easy. Yes, there is a great gulf between people who pay themselves hundreds of millions of dollars a year and think of themselves as creators, and the people who actually create the product that makes them so wealthy. And they don't see the world the same way at all. And what we're trying to say is, you may not want to see the world the way we see it, but if we withhold our labor, at a certain point, you're about to step into a content hole that will force you to be empathetic. I mean, one of the great things about television and movies is they're empathy machines. You know, you spend 2 hours seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, and then maybe you walk out of the theater and you say, maybe there's a way of looking at the world that isn't the one that I exclusively use every day unthinkingly. And I don't think the people who run these large media conglomerates are open to that kind of empathy, which is why we strike, in order to make them see it whether they want to or not.
There is an additional issue. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think the clearest, there's two like points that I think are clear evidence to that. One is the like now infamous Bob Iger call of just like Sun Valley birds tweet. I think like you can't be more out of touch than he was on that call. But I think the other one is Zaslav talking about how much money he has saved during the strike. I think this is like, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what he is doing. I don't understand, like you are in the business of making media, but you're celebrating the fact that you saved money while people are on strike. Do you want to make film and television or not? And I think if you think that, if you don't, then I don't, again, what are we here for, right? So, yeah.
Scrooge McDuck diving into his money pit.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, think of how much money McDonald's will save if they stop buying hamburger meat because all the workers aren't making hamburgers. These are sophistries that are meant to temporarily placate Wall Street while they try to figure out what the hell they're up to and grab some free operating cash and pay off a little bit of debt. But I think the other issue here is just a practical one to the question very quickly, which is, I was on the negotiating committee 20 years ago. The Writers Guild negotiating committee at that point was basically a minion. It was like a bunch of Altacockers and me, kind of pre-Altacocker, but now I'm the negotiating committee I'm now a member of is wildly different and better. Although there's a great bunch of old Altacockers back in the day, they were wonderful. But this is a whole different world, and as a group of human beings who listen to each other, are sharing vulnerabilities as well as opinions and working together. It gives me great hope that when we do close these negotiations down, we will have kept all of those kind of last in and first out members that Steven, you were talking about, as the center of our work. They're very much present in the room. Very different situation than the one I was in 20 years ago. But more importantly, on the other side of the table, look, I don't know, the labor relations hitman from whatever, Amazon or whatever. I don't know how many reports away that person is from Bezos, 8, 15, whereas 20 years ago, the hitman that, whoever sent in, Chernin or whatever, it was one report away, So this is a big issue, I think. There's a huge cultural divide, and it's causing a lot of the issues that we're facing.
Yeah. Okay, I have another question here that also gets this cultural. Oh,
Rebecca,
go ahead.
Can I dive in quick on that previous answer, because I think it feels important to know, which is that I think that the execs at the top of the mountain, the studios, the networks, they are experts on their particular platform and then their audience. They're not experts on story. And I think that, I'm going to reflect back on something that I used to say when I worked in education for 10 years, which is our lives, our lived experiences are like snowflakes, and each one is unique and different. And so, I, as someone who grew up in the South Bronx in housing projects, I know what those hallways smell like. I know what that experience feels like. There's no executive, unless they've also lived in that same environment, who is going to be able to tell me on the page that the story that I'm telling about that environment is wrong, and yet they do. And so I think what's important is that we need to respect true authorship. I think that is part of what we've seen happening. And it happens across the board. I'm sure, James and Howard have plenty of stories where they're receiving notes, and it's like, where is this note coming from? Please back up and allow us the space that we need to tell the story that we need to tell. Historically, that hasn't always happened. And I think that's again, to personalize it, that's at the core of the problem, is trust in us as storytellers to do our job.
So important. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I'm trying to see if we have room for one or two more questions. We'll go for it. So this is from Peter Fang, who's wondering if the Disney Plus release model of one episode per week versus Netflix dropping 6 to 8 episodes at once. He's saying it seems better suited to mobilizing social media buzz at the virtual water cooler. is that release strategy only possible for IP? If it were possible for writer-driven original stories, would that make a difference? So the question behind the question, how can we get the tech bros running new media to stop thinking about content as shiny things? So I feel like we've addressed this in from a few angles, but anyone have anything to add to that?
This is anecdotal, but I think the audience also dictates that in some way, because, you know, again, I mean, it's just my own experience, but I constantly see folks complaining about and hear people complaining when a show isn't dropped in just one large bundle, you know? And so I think it just depends, you know, it's how, I mean, maybe this is not the best example, but I'm thinking of shows like, because they're all IP, so it's a moot point, but I'm thinking of shows on HBO like a Game of Thrones or even The Last of Us, right? Where those aren't released in one large bundle, but they're water cooler shows. It, you know, it tends to be your genre shows that I think can sustain doing that. But the reality is I think a lot of fans of those shows would say they would love to have that Netflix model where they can just binge it over a weekend.
Mm-hmm. No. Well, got just a few minutes left. I think this is actually a really good question to sort of wrap up this conversation. This comes from Christopher Robe. As a professor and union organizer, it is often difficult to get people to recognize the labor behind intellectual or creative labor. Our industries are often considered privileged places that we should be grateful for being employed within. How do you go about stressing the labor behind the work you do to colleagues and people outside the industry?
As somebody who is the former president of the USC chapter of AAUP and spent my youth organizing salaried physicians in New York, it's hard to get people who are professionals to see themselves as workers. It always will be. I think the thing that forces professionals to see themselves as workers is their marginalization financially, when they realize that, you know, the president, the football coach, the HR people at the university are getting paid this and we're getting paid that. And I think the fact that there's such a freaking disparity between what these large shows and movies cost, you know, $300 million for Mission Impossible Fallout versus, you know, what the writers got paid. Or, you know, you can work on a show that's $15 million an episode and get $5,185 a week as a writer. I think those things tend to make people understand that they're actually labor.
And Kate?
I would just say, I mean, I'm gonna kind of approach this. I don't know if this is what Chris is going for, but I think I'm gonna approach it from teaching, which is basically that, I mean, I am just very frank always with students about both my own labor and expectations for my job, but also when we're talking about media and media industries, about those jobs, trying to put them in touch with people. I mean, I think that honestly, like younger generations actually want to understand the day-to-day, especially whether it's first-gen students or students who just have never met anyone who worked in film or television. Like they want to know what that looks like and they want to have those conversations. So I guess maybe I'm forcing these conversations on people, but I think that once they know that I am there for that conversation, they want to have it. So I'm not sure that I would say I have a hard time getting people to understand that it's difficult, but they want to know how to do it. And if they wanted to know how to like be a professor and write books, I'll like pull out my calendar and I'll say like, this is how I wrote 2 books and finished 2 books in 2021, like look at my calendar. And I think that there's a lot of people who are willing to get granular. I mean, I think what Steven was saying about getting that sort of like sit next to me and watch, right? Like, I think there's different ways that you can mentor these things.
Well, thanks so much, Kate. I think, unfortunately, there's still so much more to say, but we are out of time. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you all so much for attending this webinar. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. And we'll be keeping watch on future developments and see where this lands. So this webinar is recorded and will be posted to the Film Quarterly website in about a week's time. So you can look for it there. So thank you, everyone. Bye.